an interesting transition to go from theater to graphic novels. How was that kind of mentally to create a work like The Fifth Beatle?
I mean, I always say that I probably learned to read by reading comics. I'm a huge comic book fan, and I'm also a little bit academic, so I'm one of those fanboys that would get the collector's editions of books and read the scripts and compare them to the final pages and all that sort of thing. So when I decided that I wanted to tell the Brian Epstein story in graphic novel format, I was very comfortable with the format, although I had never worked in it before. And I was very lucky in finding an artist like Andrew Robinson, who not only is greatly talented, but we had a real vision for the story. He loved my script, and we had a very collaborative rapport. So he was very comfortable giving me storytelling ideas. I was very comfortable giving him panel suggestions, and so it really was a collaboration in that sense. So it really wasn't as intimidating as you might have thought it could be. It was really a joy.
What was it about
it was great fun.
What was it about Brian Epstein's story that resonated with you?
Yeah, so I grew up a big Beatles fan, so I started with that. But I was in business school, dreaming about doing some of the things I'm doing now, working in entertainment. And as I said, I tend to be a little academic, so I thought if I'm going to work in entertainment, I should study the lives of the great entertainment visionaries, which is what led me to a study of Brian Epstein, thinking that Brian and the Beatles kind of wrote the rules of the pop music business. And I was a young man looking for business inspiration. I wanted to know how he got them a record deal when no one wanted to sign them, how he thought of the suits and the haircuts, how he convinced Ed Sullivan to book them when British bands had never cracked the States, all those stories. And those stories are wonderful and inspiring, and they're all in the book, and that's great, and that's what I was looking for. But it was the human side of his story, really, that I knew nothing about, that struck a very deep chord for me. In brief, he was gay and Jewish and from Liverpool. And in the 1960s, those were three significant obstacles. It was a felony to be gay. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, and Liverpool was a port town. There was nothing cultural going on there. So here was this gay Jewish man from Liverpool saying, I found a band and they're going to be bigger than Elvis. It was crazy. And I certainly don't want to pretend that the obstacles I faced in my life have been that severe, but I'm a first-generation American. My family's from Guyana, South America, by way of India. And you don't see young people of my ethnicity going into these fields, with the exception of Bollywood, which is a very specific thing. You don't see young kids of Indian origin getting into theater production and film production and writing graphic novels. And so I really could relate to that sense of being an outsider. And so Brian's story was just terribly inspirational to me. So that's why Brian.
It's an interesting story too, because so much of it is public, and yet so much of it is not known.
Yeah.
It's hard to think of another topic that's been written as much as the Beatles, maybe the Civil War, honestly.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of tread that line of being fresh and also...
Well, I actually think with Brian, the Brian Epstein story is a rare Beatles story that hasn't really been told. When people ask, about research for this project, I've been researching it since I was in school 15, 20 years ago. And most of that research is interviews, because there are no good books about Brian. There's one that's great that's been out of print for 20 years, but outside of that, there just aren't any good books about him. And because it was a felony to be gay, the people who knew him and worked closest with him weren't comfortable talking about that, because in his lifetime it was against the law, and after his lifetime it was socially unacceptable. And I would say it's really only been in the past 5 to 7 years that those people who knew him closest and could answer those questions are willing to talk about it. So it was actually, in terms of keeping it fresh, I think that part of wasn't that hard. It was, how do I get to the story? That part was the harder part. Was just getting these people to open up to me, because they've never talked. A lot of these people never talked about stuff like that. Brian's best friend, his former assistant, etc. So,
I mean, in an odd way, the fact that society is so much more open up to pro-gay sort of literature allows a book like this to be created then.
No question. I mean, I would like to say that this story should have been told 20 years ago, and it should have, but in a lot of ways, its time has come now, because the public, I think, is more tolerant and ready to read stories like this and understand the heart of stories like this.
Right.
And certainly the people who knew it, knew the details of it, are more, as I said, more comfortable about talking about it. So its time has come, and I'm just thrilled to be the guy telling it,
Yeah, well, it must have been exciting to work with Andrew Robinson, too. How did you approach, you obviously probably have quite a bit of music in there.
Yeah.
It's always an interesting question how creators approach the depiction of music in their work.
Sure. Well, from the very beginning, we viewed this project, or I viewed this project as two-pronged, as a graphic novel and a film, and two very different things. I wrote a screenplay and a graphic novel script that are very different. They obviously share a lot of similarities, but they are very different. And with the film, the big news on the film adaptation is we've secured the rights to Beatles music. We have the approval of the band, and we signed a deal with the music publisher. Literally, we are the first first film about the band in history to have gotten their music rights. And so that's very, very exciting for us, obviously. But it also means that ever since the very beginning of this project, we were thinking about the use of music and how music would fit into both the film and the graphic novel. And I think Andrew's work is very painterly and it's very dynamic. You can even tell from the cover. There's a lot of motion there. Yeah. And to me, this cover sings. You know, and so we tried to think about that in the performance sequences of the book. How do we make those pages kind of sing? You know, and yes, there are reprints of lyrics, but we really, you know, in fact, oftentimes the places where we used lyrics were places where the panels weren't singing dynamically in terms of the art. So it's really a difficult balance to tread, but I think we did a pretty good job with it.
It's an interesting thing because like this year's winner for Best Graphic Novel, the Carter Family book, they addressed that in a very specific way and I think very moving way. So
yeah, and we did some of the, I don't know how well you remember that book, but we did some similar things. With the lettering in this book was very important. You know, the shapes of the balloons was very important, and much in the same way in the Carter book, they did some very interesting things with lettering and balloons and captions to convey that this is a moment where they're singing. This is a moment that are harmonies. You know, so we had a lot of fun with that.
So these are very beloved people.
Yeah.
They've been fans have been giant fans for decades, including yourself.
Yeah.
Was it imposing, frightening? How did you make sure the depiction of them really was true to who they are?
I mean, it was definitely something we spent a lot of time on with reference materials. And, when I first started developing this project about 6 years ago, the very first thing I did was I flew to Liverpool. And at the risk of sounding a little bit crazy, the first thing I did was I actually went to the cemetery and I sat down and asked Brian's permission. But then after that, I met with his family, I met the estate, and got their blessing, their support. This is not an officially endorsed project, but the estate of Brian has been very supportive. They wanted to get out of my way a little bit so it could be a warts and all story, so it's not whitewashed. But then the very next thing I did after that was I reached out to Paul, Ringo, Yoko, and Olivia Harrison. I even made a joke. I said, I'm not asking for anything. I'll probably reach out to you one day and ask for something, but today I just want you to know that I exist. This is my background. Here's what I've worked on. I do have the support of the Brian Epstein estate, and this is what I'm doing. And they all got back to me and said thank you and good luck on your project. And so that was the beginning of a relationship where every time there was some new news, I was able to keep in touch and just tell them what I was working on. So from the very beginning, I've tried to foster a lot of goodwill with the bands and their widows. And I think that's a large part of why we were eventually able to get the music rights when we finally had a request, so to speak.
You're in a uniquely good position to get access to these people. So
yeah, I suppose I was. I've done a lot of work in the music business. Music really is in my blood. Before I was producing Broadway musicals, I worked for the music industry. I was with Mercury Records. So I really, I guess music is an arena that I'm very comfortable operating in. And even though no one had gotten the Beatles music, I guess I was confident enough, arrogant enough, sure enough that this was a good project that I knew I would get him. It took me 2.5 years, but we got him,
So it's cool that the family was very willing to let you do the warts and all story too. I mean, it's hard to navigate that ground between being scurrilous and just being true to the character. How'd you kind of navigate that? I mean, it's easy to create gossip.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the Brian Epstein story has been very inspirational to me. So this is a real labor of love project. I often describe Brian as my historical mentor. He died before I was born, but he's somebody whose life I've looked at to learn from. And I use the word mentor very carefully because I'm not a fan. I think fandom implies a certain degree of unconditional love, and I'm a fan of many things, including the Beatles.
Right.
But with Brian, I think there's a lot of things he did not do right. And granted, as I said earlier, he had obstacles I didn't. But he didn't make enough time for the love that was around him. And I try not to do that. I try with my family. I have a wife and kids that I adore, and no matter how much I love what I do and how busy I am, I need to remember to make time for my family. And I don't think Brian did enough of those kinds of things. So anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying that the way that I approach the Brian Epstein story, I think is very heartfelt. And heartfelt in the way that I approach the warts as well as the lighter parts, And I think the estate could see that I wasn't setting out to do something that was going to be gossipy, and that I think Brian did have a lot of warts. There were a lot of things that is dark and sad about his story, and I want to get into that. It's dramatic and it's real, and I'm trying to tell the full picture of the story. So I guess I just, as cheesy as it sounds, I just tried to be true to my heart and true to the way I saw the story, and hoped that truth and the passion that I have for it would shine through to the people in charge of the legacy, and I think it did.
Do you have a favorite Brian Epstein story that you learned when working on this book?
There are so many. I mean, that was one of the hardest things with both the book and the film is trying to figure out what to leave in and what to leave out.
Of course.
What to put in and what to leave out. And in some ways, that's also been one of the benefits of doing both a film and a book, is that there's certain things that I could put in the film that I would leave out of the book, and so I was able to kind of get more stories in that way by treating the two as separate projects.
Is there one that you didn't get in but really wanted to squeeze in?
I don't think so, actually.
Okay.
I think we did a pretty good job.
Not to quiz you,
No, it's okay. It's okay. I just don't want to give away too much because I want people to read the book. But I don't think so. I think we did a pretty good job about picking the right ones. There are probably things in there that Beatles fans would like to see that are more Beatles-y stories than Brian's stories. But we wanted to also remain true to the fact that we're telling Brian's story, not the Beatles story.
Well, there's plenty of good Beatles stories out there, right? There's not a good story about Brian.
That's
really.
Exactly right. I feel like with the Beatles, we've heard it all before, and yes, this for Beatles fans, this is going to be a revelation, I believe, because it's a way of looking at the Beatles story, a perspective into the Beatles story that you don't often see. So I think Beatles fans are going to love it. But I also, as I keep coming back to, I think it's an inspirational human story at its core. So with the film adaptation, for example, I always say even though technically it's a music-related biopic, it's less Walk the Line or Ray, and it's more Rocky or Billy Elliot. It's that least likely guy to succeed, going the distance in their chosen field. And much the same way you don't need to be a boxing fan to like Rocky, you certainly don't need to be a ballet fan to appreciate Billy Elliot. If we've done our job correctly, our readers won't need to be Beatles fans to love this book. They'll need to just be people who believe who want to be inspired, who want to learn about believing in your dreams, and that's what I think the story really is about. So.
It's the ultimate believing in your dreams, isn't it?
It is.
I mean,
absolutely.
You literally could not ask for more success than he had doing what he did.
Yeah. And it's cautionary at the same time because it's a tragic story. Here's a guy that devoted his life to spreading the Beatles' message of love to the entire world, and yet he died at the age of 32, never having had a real boyfriend. So there's a tragedy to it as well. Yeah. So it's inspiring and cautionary at the same time, and I believe cautionary is inspiring because there's something that you can learn from the story.
What year did he die?
He died in 1967. Yeah. Post Sgt. Pepper's, post All You Need Is Love. The Beatles were working on the material that wound up on the White Album. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So really right at the peak of their.
Yeah, I mean,
when they became completely ubiquitous, and when they changed the culture at that point.
That's right. Oh yeah.
The culture really reflected their values. So that is a very tragic thing. He didn't get to see what happened from there.
Well, yeah. I mean, he did. He always said the Beatles were going to elevate pop music to an art form.
Right.
And that the Beatles were cultural icons, not just music icons, or could become cultural icons. And he did get to see that. He did get to see that, but it was right there that he passed away. He didn't really get to see the legacy that would, 20 years later, that people would still care. But he used to say that. Brian he ran a record store, so he was definitely aware of the pop music of the time. He knew all the hits, the pop hits, the rock hits, but that's not what he listened to. As a fan, he listened to classical music. He listened to classical and the Beatles, And so he always said that the Beatles, as composers, he believed that one day they would be taken as seriously as Beethoven and Mozart and the classical composers that he knew and loved. And at the time, that was ludicrous.
Yeah.
But, so I don't think he got to see that. I don't think he got to see that 20 years later, people might be like, he was onto something with that comment, He saw the bigger than Elvis, but the Beethoven, Mozart, it's a pity he didn't get to see that.
So tell me your theory. If he had lived, how much longer would the Beatles have lasted?
I mean, this is speculation.
Yeah.
But I believe that Brian would have found a way to have not really ever let the Beatles have disbanded, and whether that meant they would have taken years off to pursue solo projects and do other things and then come back to record a record, or maybe they would have all worked on a film together. I don't know what it would have meant, but I don't think he would have ever allowed a situation where somebody could say the Beatles broke up. It would be just that they're not doing anything right now. I mean, he viewed the Beatles as a family. He thought they were his family in a way.
Right,
they were the boys, the children that he could never have, And so the way that family is always family, you can't ever, as much as you may not get along with your family, they'll always be your family. I think he believed that the Beatles would always be the Beatles. He couldn't imagine a world where they weren't together. In fact, if I can make a few plugs, we debuted a book trailer this week. You can see it immediately at www.fifthbeatle.com. And the book comes out on November 19th, and we're already taking pre-orders. You can buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, or IndieBound. And so the process is almost at a place where I can start to breathe and start thinking of the next one. You know,
got to do the publicity tour first.
But of course, yeah, and that's what I'm doing here. So and that's great fun. But I'm ready for the next challenge.